let's walk through a very simple yet succinct example as to how someone who maybe is not currently in shape, maybe a little bit older, let's say 32, and wants to get in better shape to do athletic things. And let's say in this example, those athletic things might be a court-based sport. So something like basketball, tennis, whatever. So let's just talk about this and walk through it and how it's going to point out some big myths in regards to fitness and some big things that you yourself might really want to consider when it comes to getting in shape. So first and foremost, what does it mean to be in shape? There is probably some sort of actual morphology of shape, that is the shape of your body in terms of how much body fat you actually have. But it's a little more detailed than that, because there's also a conditioned aspect, a conditioning aspect, that doesn't really fall under the umbrella of something aesthetic. So what I mean by that is you can look a certain way, but that doesn't mean you're going to perform a certain way. I might have similar body fat percentage to Michael Phelps. I cannot even come close to swimming down and back in a pool, let alone doing anything remotely near the capacity to what Michael Phelps could do. So right off the bat, our looks don't tell us what we can do. Our physiology tells us what we can do. Our physiology, which is comprised of our nervous system, our muscles, you can just think about your neuromuscular system, and then the actual operations occurring inside your muscles, that is the fiber types, the mitochondrial density, the capillary bedding, the muscle tendon unit, so the tendon and muscle interaction, different anthropometrics that aren't changeable, so things like limb length and so on, but certain aspects that are changeable, that is not anthropometrics. I mean, I'm lost for words right now. Certain ranges of motion, biomechanics that are changeable. Couldn't remember what I was trying to say. Anthropometrics might be like your limb length, but something biomechanical might be, the range of motion your hip can go through. So you can't change the length of your femur, but maybe you can change the mobility of your hip. So now we have a little bit of an outline here. Let's talk about actually getting in shape. When I've dealt with clients, the most common thing they want to do is they want to lose weight by training more and eating less. And to me, this is not the best option, because if you're not changing your body weight, that means you're not gaining weight. You're at a caloric neutral, right? What goes in, goes out, and you kind of remain the same. So if I want to eat less because I want to lose my body weight and then train more, I'm actually placing paradoxical demands on the body. One, I'm eating less, so naturally my body is going to lose weight. I don't need to train more to lose weight. I'm already eating less, so I've already dropped into a negative. But by training more, now I burn more calories, so I'm now eating less. It's like a double negative. And now I have even more demands for energy, but I'm not giving it enough fuel. But on top of that, because I'm training hard, I'm signaling my body to create adaptation, structural changes within the body. My muscles are trying to grow. I'm trying to produce new or stronger organelles, such as your mitochondria. I am having to use a lot of substrates to rebuild my infrastructure. The thing is, if I start eating less and training more, I'm not giving myself the equipment and materials to rebuild. So what I like to think about is doing this in a multi-stage process. If you're just looking to lose some weight, you're not trying to get any specific condition, and you don't really want to work out, I suppose eating a little bit less is a great place to start. Because then you're going to drop down, and you might not eat that much less, but you might lose, let's say, some pounds here and there. Okay, now you've gotten used to eating at that level. Your body has stabilized around that caloric intake, and now you can start maybe training a bit more. Okay, now we're training a bit more, and we start to lose a little bit of weight, because you are going to naturally lose weight as you train more, because you're burning some calories, but we're not in this double negative situation. The reason why I want to avoid those compounding negatives, the less food and train more, is because what happens is people tend to fall off a cliff in terms of their energy levels. They go from kind of a caloric deficit to a massive caloric deficit in a week and a half, and they don't like it. They don't feel good. They don't enjoy the workouts. So we're trying to figure out how we can actually sustain workouts and progress over time. We have to look at it from the lens of I'm trying to rebuild and repair and grow tissues. If I'm trying to lose weight, then maybe that's just the specific goal. And then we get into the training aspect. That doesn't mean you can't do them in parallel or in tandem. I just personally, in experience from myself and working with clients, doing them both aggressively at the same time is really a recipe for, not a great outcome, simply because if you haven't been training, it's a lot of demand on your body, and you haven't been eating less, you don't know really how much your caloric intake should be adjusted. People go all in because they're motivated, and then they can, 2 weeks later, kind of give up. Okay, so we have an aesthetic aspect of it. Now we have to talk about the conditioning aspect. So the aesthetic aspect is simply the weight loss, the body fat percentage, and understanding what you're trying to accomplish. Within that umbrella, when you do have a caloric deficit, maybe you want to make sure you're eating a little bit more protein or getting enough protein for your demands and the right types of macronutrients. A lot of times people just cut out all their carbs, yet they're training really hard. So again, not a good recipe. So now we go to the conditioning aspect. Conditioning is really all about what you are now relative to where you want to go. And what you are now is a kind of an aggregate total of what you've been doing the past 2 months. So if you haven't been running, walking, or anything of that nature, and you go out and you want to run sprints the first day, you're not going to be in condition to do that. Instead, let's focus on, if I were to go sprint today, what could go wrong? Well, my hamstrings aren't used to that kind of velocity of movement. I'm not used to that kind of vertical impact. And then you break down the physics and the imposed physiological demands of that exercise, like sprinting, and you say, well, okay, I'm not there yet, but what are some things that can build up those qualities I need to handle sprinting? Well, maybe going for a walk is a great place to start if you haven't done that. Maybe jogging. Maybe just slowly jogging, and each stride gets a little bit faster until you're going about 70% of a sprint. Again, all relative to what you have been doing, because if you have been jogging but you haven't been sprinting, that 70% kind of speed might be a good place to start. If you haven't been jogging and you've just been walking, maybe just introducing a light jog. And if you haven't been walking, maybe just introducing walking. Because what we need to realize is that when we're applying those large vertical impact forces on our body, it's not just the muscles working, there's osteokinetic loading. That is, your bones are being loaded. Those tissues, like your tendons, are being loaded. And we can run into tendonitis type things. We can run into stress fractures and all these other issues associated with excessive spikes and loading. So, what do I wrap into that? We have to understand what we're actually trying to condition for. If you're trying to sprint, what are the requirements of sprinting? It's not a physical look. It is a structural demand that the body can handle. Now, just because you can, and this is really important, by the way, just because you can do something doesn't mean you can sustain that something over a total week. So that's the next step is we want to talk about is condition isn't just one single output. It's the capacity or the ability to handle repeated outputs over a given period of time. Yes, if a lion jumped out and said, "Rawr," maybe you could sprint and run away just fine. That's one time in kind of an extreme situation. You can do it. I technically could go run a marathon today. The repercussions of running that marathon today over the next month and a half would probably be very large. So I don't actually have the capacity to sustain it. So when we talk about amplification of training intensity, so we're increasing the intensity. So, hey, when should I progress? I think about it in chunks. Let's focus on this week doing one thing, and next week do the same thing for just half the week, but the other half do a little bit more. So it's kind of like adding 0.5. And based on your comfort level and how you feel, you can maybe be a little more or a little less aggressive. Okay, this first week, I jogged a whole bunch. Next week, I'm going to try and jog sometimes and maybe add a little bit of close to maximal velocity sprinting just for 3 to 4 steps. And then the week after, maybe I'm going to do some close to maximal sprinting for 3 to 4 steps and maybe some for 5 to 7 steps. And then the next week, I'm actually going to try and sprint once and then jog a couple times because I know sprinting is demanding. Let me back off a little bit to see how my body feels, and then maybe I'll sprint again. So you're slowly adding in the imposed demands without aggressively spiking them, so you can actually take in the information and see whether or not it's causing any ill effects to your body. So the condition to do something happens at a physiological level. The aesthetic aspect of conditioning is typically it's the body fat stuff. And now it's really important to understand what you're doing, because just because you're doing something doesn't mean you're doing something that's going to help you do something else. What I mean by that is you might say, I want to get better at jogging. I want to run a marathon. So I'm going to bike a whole bunch because someone told me that biking can improve your VO2. That's going to improve my cardiovascular fitness. Where cardiovascular fitness is a very general aspect of the body. It is your heart and its ability to have cardiac, the fitness of your cardiovascular system. So you think about things like stroke volume, think about things like your heart rate, think about things like, I'm blanking right now, but like the ejection fraction. And you can think about just cardiac output itself is stroke volume times, right? The blood flow coming out of it and then the ejection fraction, something like that. I'm totally blanking. Sorry, cardiovascular fitness fans. So there's like the general cardiovascular aspect, that is the heart, and then the movement of blood to said working limbs. But then there's the local effects that occur. Like if I'm running, I have a certain impact in terms of the physics actually placed upon my foot, knee, and hip that I don't get with biking. So while I bike a whole bunch, sure, I get cardiovascular fitness, and maybe I even improve things like capillary bedding and mitochondrial density within the localized working muscles that are the same as running even, my quads. But I don't have that physical impact loading. So the osteokinetic loading isn't the same. The loading on the bones and tendon is not the same. So I'm really not in condition to actually do what I'm trying to accomplish. And this is why, as a trainer, it's really important to be really specific with your clients and understand, yeah, we've been doing athletic things, we've been running and jumping. That doesn't mean you're ready to swim. Yeah, we've been squatting, but that doesn't mean you're ready for a kettlebell swing. So I always like to dip my toes into the water before I get after it. Now, as someone who's a little bit older in this example, like I said, the 32-year-old, you have to realize that sometimes when you take a lot of time off, some of us maybe 8 years, like 10 years, 30% of your life from sprinting, you might not have sprinted since you've been 20, we're going to take a little bit of time to get back to where we want to be. It's not going to be 1 week or maybe even not even 1 month. It might be like 6 or 7 months because we have to rebuild what we had lost. Yes, you might have sprinted the previous 9 years prior to that, from when you're 11 to 20, for whatever sporting demands you had. But from 20 to 32, if you haven't sprinted, we probably had a lot of degradation in those tissues that had been adapted. So understanding what you had been doing is really, really important. And last but not least, this is why it's so important. If you don't use it, you lose it. So just doing things that are fitting to your demands and your needs, even a couple times a week, is an amazing way to sustain some of those athletic qualities. If you like playing basketball and stuff, and you want to keep playing basketball, one of the best ways to keep in shape to play basketball is to do basketball-like things. If you like to play tennis, tennis-like things. Because if you don't for a while, then you might get something like tennis elbow, or you might get something with your hips bothering you, or your shoulder bothering you, so on and so forth, simply because you haven't been exposed to those type of demands. Just because you play basketball doesn't mean your shoulder is ready for tennis, and vice versa. So when we sit down and think about where we want to go, we think about it in terms of our condition, our physical body mass, because it's technically speaking, if we have a little bit less fat and we're in a kind of a range that is more optimal, then that's less non-propellant tissue. That is, your muscles propel you, less active contractile tissue that places demand in your body that isn't necessarily there. It's like the extra 7 pounds that maybe doesn't need to be there per step, making each step less demanding. And This is so important because when we think about people who've squatted a whole bunch, been lifting a whole bunch, but haven't been running, they're just not ready to still run. So you still have to build into it. Some couple of things that you can consider on top of this is that when you decide to get back into whatever shape you want to be and where you want to go, it's understanding that listening to your body is a good thing at times. And you don't have to follow some rigid protocol in terms of, I have to advance this week or the next week. Sometimes aches and pains do come up, and addressing those aches and pains is really important because constantly dealing with something that's causing a slight deviation in loading mechanics or running form can irritate other areas as well. So if I were to start getting back in shape for something, it's really, really important to understand the intensities of exercises. So if I'm running again and jumping again, we know those impacts are really important. We know that impacts can be more emphasized at the ankle, more emphasized at the knee, and more emphasized somewhat at the hip based on how much torso flexion is, how much knee flexion there is, and how much ankle flexion there is. And we can think about the speed at which we're getting off the ground. Is it really fast? Is it really slow? We can think about the transference of momentum. Is it going from down to vertically back up? From vertical, so like straight vertical down to vertical back up? Is it more horizontal, like you're skipping a stone? Is it something in between? Because when we go straight down to straight back up, we don't have much conservation of momentum. Versus if we're going horizontal, we have a little friendlier conservation of momentum. It's a little less demanding on some of those braking forces to stop us completely, because when you're running and jogging, you're kind of keeping the motion going, versus if you're landing from a box and jumping back up as high as you can, you essentially bring your velocity to a net zero before going back up vertical, which places a lot of demand on the body. All these things should be considered, and then kind of breaking them down into, am I doing this movement with a long ground contact time or a short ground contact time? And then how much effort am I actually exerting? Because you can do jumps at 60%, at 70% effort and get a lot of benefit from it. You can jog at 60 and 70% effort. You can do things that, I'm going to take a quick little pogo hop and jump over a hurdle, but maybe I'm not going to do it as fast as I possibly can. I'm just going to do it in a nice, comfortable rhythm and pace. Maybe I'm not going to jump as high as I can. Maybe I do 2 feet instead of 1 foot. Maybe I work in positions I'm more comfortable until I can progress into less comfortable, so on and so forth. So I really hope this helps. And if you guys have specific questions, I'm happy to make some video that details a little bit more of it, but I'd rather start with something a little more general like this to get the ball rolling. And if you guys are watching this on YouTube, feel free to leave a comment. If you're watching this, or I guess you're listening to this on my podcast, I just want to say thank you as always. So I appreciate y'all, and take care.